Before we begin, stay with this. If you've seen the footage, you know what the 6th of June 1944 looks like from the Allied side. Young men in gray pre-dawn light, ramps dropping, a wall of water and chaos and extraordinary courage. That story has been told so many times, in so many languages, that we've almost stopped hearing it. But there is another story, one that lives in German after-action reports, in the wartime memoirs of ordinary infantrymen, in the technical logs of coastal artillery batteries, and in the quietly devastating letters home from men who stood inside concrete bunkers and watched the horizon fill with ships. Tonight, this is their story, not the ideology, not the propaganda. The human experience of watching the largest amphibious invasion in history arrive at your doorstep. While your general was at his wife's birthday party, your Führer was asleep, and your Air Force was nowhere to be found. I've spent a long time with these documents. The picture that emerges is complicated, sobering, and in places genuinely strange. It doesn't fit neatly into the narrative of either side. Pour something warm. Settle in. This is going to take a while, and it should. Roughly 3 to 4 hours, 15 chapters, one long night. These men stood watch in the dark. The least we can do is keep them company. If you enjoy this kind of deep archive historical documentary, hit subscribe and the notification bell. New long-form histories every week. Now, let's go back. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from concrete. And by the spring of 1944, Germany had poured more concrete into the coastline of Western Europe than almost any engineering project in history. 17 million cubic yards of it, according to figures compiled after the war. Enough, as one American historian later calculated, to construct roughly 270 Empire State buildings. Added to that was 1.3 million short tons of steel, woven into bunkers, artillery casemates, observation posts, and anti-tank walls stretching from the Spanish border all the way north to Norway, a distance of more than 5,000 kilometers of fortified European coastline. The Germans called it the Atlantic Wall, and German propaganda loved it. I want to be honest about something here, because I think the propaganda has distorted our understanding of this structure for decades. When you watch wartime newsreel footage of the Atlantic Wall, and it was shown constantly to the German public, you tend to see the same images recycled. Massive gun batteries, determined soldiers, the impression of impenetrability. What the cameras rarely showed was the enormous stretches between those showcased installations where the defenses were unfinished or manned by troops who wouldn't have been anyone's first choice for a fight. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, appointed to command Army Group B in November of 1943, toured his new command and was reportedly appalled at what he found. Not everywhere, but enough places to worry a man with his experience of what Allied firepower actually looked like up close. Rommel had fought the British in North Africa. He knew what Royal Air Force and American air support could do to ground forces caught in the open. His conclusion, which he argued forcefully, and which became one of the defining strategic debates of the Normandy campaign, was that the panzers had to be at the beach, not held back in reserve, not kept north of Paris for a grand armored counterattack, but right at the waterline. Because if you let the Allies get ashore and consolidate, he believed, the fighter bombers would make it impossible to move your armor at all. He was right about that. He just didn't get the resources to implement the plan. His superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, held the opposite view. Von Rundstedt favored orthodox doctrine. Keep a strong, centralized armored reserve. Wait for the Allies to commit, then smash them with a concentrated counterstrike. Both arguments had genuine military logic. Hitler, characteristically, resolved the debate by doing neither. The armored reserve was split up in a way that satisfied no general and served no single strategy effectively. 4 panzer divisions were placed under direct OKW control, meaning Hitler's personal control, and could not be moved without his explicit authorization. On the day those divisions were needed most, the man whose authorization was required was asleep. So that's the structural reality behind the impressive posters. A wall of concrete with real teeth in some places and genuine gaps in others. Defending a coastline so long that concentrating against any given point was always going to be an exercise in guesswork, backed by an armored reserve that was legally paralyzed without a signature from a man who kept irregular hours. I don't say that to mock. I say it because understanding the institutional dysfunction on the German side is essential to understanding why what happened on the 6th of June unfolded the way it did. It wasn't simply Allied brilliance versus German incompetence. It was Allied organization against German organizational dysfunction. And those are different things. The men in the bunkers didn't design the strategy. They didn't choose the reserve doctrine or decide where the panzers went. They showed up every morning, cleaned their weapons, watched the channel, and waited. By late May of 1944, they'd been waiting for a long time, and the waiting, as we'll see, had its own particular effect on the human mind. The ordinary men in the bunkers. Let's talk about who was actually in those fortifications, because the post-war mythology tends to paint the German defenders as an elite force. Some of them were, most weren't. The 5 infantry divisions holding the coastal sectors targeted by the Allied landings were a mixed picture. 2 of them, the 243rd and 709th, were what the Germans called static divisions, units with little transport, minimal motorization, and a mandate to hold their ground and die there if necessary. Their men were older on average. Many had been combed from other units, were recovering from wounds, or had been deemed insufficiently fit for the Eastern Front. That's not a flattering assessment, and it wasn't meant to be. It was simply the German Army's own internal calculus for how to allocate limited manpower across a war that was eating through men faster than it could replace them. Then there were the Ostlegionen, the Eastern battalions, former Soviet prisoners of war, men from Soviet-occupied territories, conscripted or volunteered into German service under conditions that varied from unit to unit but were rarely straightforward. They made up roughly 1/6 of 7th Army's total strength. Their reliability was a constant source of anxiety for German commanders, and frankly, when I read through the assessments of them in German planning documents, there's a kind of bleak, institutional honesty there. These were men pressed into service for a cause that was not theirs, asked to defend a wall built partly by slave labor, against an invasion that, for many of them, represented something other than what their German officers told them it did. Their story is one of the most tangled in the entire Normandy campaign, and it's one I find myself coming back to. The bright exception was the 352nd Infantry Division, which arrived in the Normandy sector in the spring of 1944 and was undetected by Allied intelligence when it took up its position. This was a genuine field formation. Experienced, well-trained, leavened by veterans who'd fought in the East. Its 916th Grenadier Regiment held a position that any defensive commander would have recognized as almost ideal. A natural amphitheater of steep bluffs curving around a wide, open beach, with concrete observation posts and firing positions commanding every inch of the approach. The Americans would call that beach Omaha. The Germans manning it had no such poetic name for it. To them, it was simply their sector, their post, where they'd been told to stand. I think about those garrison troops sometimes. Not the ideologically committed ones, but the ordinary draftees who'd ended up in a coastal bunker in Normandy rather than in the rubble of Stalingrad, and who understood that this had been a matter of paperwork and luck and nothing more. They had a daily routine. They had watch rotations. They played cards. They wrote letters. A soldier is a soldier long before he's a fighter, and the weeks and months of monotonous garrison duty in northern France had settled into these men the particular, numbed alertness of people who've been told something terrible is coming without being told exactly when. Every night, patrols. Every morning, the sea. Empty. Again, until it wasn't. Rommel's dilemma and the logic of the beach. I want to spend some time with Rommel here, because his story in the weeks before D-Day is genuinely instructive. and genuinely strange when you look at the timing. By the late spring of 1944, he was driving himself across the length of Army Group B's sector with characteristic intensity, personally inspecting fortifications, demanding more mines, more obstacles, more beach stakes. The number of mines laid in his sector increased dramatically under his push. Anti-boat obstacles, the hedgehogs, the ramp-shaped Element C barriers, the Belgian gates, went up by the millions along the likely landing beaches. His fundamental argument was clear and, in retrospect, compelling. Air power had changed the nature of armored operations. In North Africa, he'd watched what happened to vehicle columns exposed to air attack, not necessarily destroyed outright, but stopped, pinned, disrupted, delayed. And delay was everything in a counterattack scenario. If the Allies got ashore and dug in and called down naval gunfire support from a fleet that was, and this part still staggers me when I look at the numbers, equipped with battleships, whose main guns could reach 20 kilometers or more inland, then any German tank column trying to approach the beachhead would face a gauntlet of fire from above and from the sea simultaneously. His logic was not wrong. It just wasn't implemented. He wrote to his wife in early June that he was more confident than he'd been at any point. He genuinely believed that the fortifications, combined with a rapid armored response in the first hours, could throw the Allies back. And then he went home. The 6th of June fell during a period of bad channel weather that the German meteorologists had assessed as unsuitable for an invasion. Rommel's own weathermen told him the conditions in early June wouldn't support a major amphibious operation. They weren't wrong about the weather being bad. They were wrong about whether bad weather would stop the Allies. So, on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, the commander of Army Group B, the man most responsible for the beach defenses, was at his home in Herrlingen, in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday. He wasn't reachable by standard communication at the moment the reports began coming in. By the time word reached him and he began the long drive back to his headquarters, the situation had already moved beyond the point where his presence at the coast could have changed what happened in the critical first hours. I don't say this to excuse. I say it because it's historical fact and because it illustrates something important. The German defensive plan for June of 1944 was built entirely on the assumption that there would be time to respond, that the weather would provide warning, that command and control would function. Take away those assumptions, and the architecture of the defense, elaborate and expensive as it was, had a fundamental brittleness to it that the German High Command had never quite confronted directly. The Atlantic Wall was a deterrent as much as a defense, and deterrents depend on the other side believing in them. The night the engines came. Now we're getting to the night itself, the 5th of June into the 6th. And here is where things get genuinely strange, because by any reasonable measure, the Germans had warning, significant warning. The question of why that warning didn't translate into an effective response is one of the more painful operational questions of the entire war. Let me walk through what was known and when. Allied bombers had been hitting German coastal installations and radar stations along the Normandy coastline for weeks, intensifying in the days before the landing. The Germans noticed. They assessed it as part of a broader pre-invasion preparation, but the bombing was spread across a wide area. Deliberately, as part of the Allied deception plan, which meant that no single sector could be identified as the priority target. The Calais area received more attention in some respects, which fed into the existing German belief, carefully cultivated by Operation Fortitude and an array of Allied deception measures, that the main blow would fall northeast of Normandy in the Pas de Calais. On the night of the 5th of June, thousands of Allied transport aircraft began crossing the Channel. The engines of roughly 13,000 aircraft going overhead in the dark is not a subtle sound. German troops along the Norman coast heard them. In some units, alarms were raised, but the initial interpretation was consistent with previous Allied operations: supply drops, diversionary raids, the kind of airborne feints the Germans had seen before. What they hadn't seen before, and couldn't quite process in real time, was the sheer scale of what was now in motion. The first Allied paratroopers, American from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, British from the 6th Airborne, began landing in Normandy in the small hours of the 6th of June, several hours before the beach landings. At this point, something interesting happened at the operational level. General Friedrich Dahlmann, commanding the German 7th Army, had scheduled a map exercise, a war game, in Rennes for the morning of the 6th of June, specifically designed to test German responses to an Allied landing. His division commanders were on the road to Rennes. When the reports of airborne landings began arriving, they were recalled. They turned their cars around and drove back. Meanwhile, the one reserve force available to the LX Corps, the formation commanded by Colonel Ernest Meyer, was dispatched inland in the wrong direction, chasing a report of paratroop activity near Carentan that turned out to be inaccurate. By the time that was sorted out, the beach landings were beginning. The chaos wasn't stupidity. It was the operational consequence of a defensive plan built on the assumption that warning would be clear, unambiguous, and early enough to allow coordination. Instead, the warning was fragmentary. The reports were contradictory. The key commanders were absent or unreachable, and the weather that had seemed to argue against an invasion had apparently not argued against it with the same force for Eisenhower. The Germans on the night of the 5th of June into the 6th were not complacent exactly. Many of them were alert and anxious and watching the sky. They just couldn't assemble the fragments into a coherent picture quickly enough. And in military operations, timing is almost everything. General Wilhelm Falley of the 91st Air Landing Division heard the aircraft engines that night and understood what they meant. He turned his car around. He drove back toward his headquarters at speed. He drove into an American ambush. Paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne who'd set up in the dark, and he was killed. He became the first German general officer to die on D-Day. He didn't even make it back to his headquarters. From the pillbox. What they actually saw. By 0630 hours on the morning of the 6th of June, the first American landing craft were dropping their ramps on the beaches. And now we get to the heart of what I find most difficult to convey, and most important to get right. Because the experience of the German defenders in those first hours is preserved. Imperfectly, partially, in the way all human memory is preserved. In memoirs and after-action reports and letters. Home. And what comes through is something more complicated than either fanatical resistance or bewildered confusion. At Strong Point Widerstandsnest 62, WN 62, as it appears in German records. On the bluffs above what the Allies designated Omaha Beach, a machine gunner named Heinrich Severloh was at his post when the first landing craft came in. His account, published decades later as a memoir, describes watching the American boats approach in the early morning light and understanding with an immediacy that no strategic briefing could have conveyed what was actually happening. He fired. He fired for hours. His memoir describes 9 hours at his position, firing at the landing force below. The account is painful to read, not because of the volume of fire, though that detail is there, but because of what it reveals about the interior experience of a man doing something he understood was terrible, and that he did anyway because the alternative, as he saw it, was to not do his duty. I'm not here to adjudicate that. The moral weight of those hours belongs to history, but the human reality of it, a young man in a concrete box watching the world change below him, is something the documents preserve and that I think deserves acknowledgement. The 352nd Division's positions on Omaha were, by the standards of the June landing, extraordinarily well situated. The natural geography of that beach, the curved bluffs, the narrow strand, the absence of cover, created a killing ground that no military engineer would have needed to improve much. The first Americans to hit the beach at 6:30 in the morning ran into a wall of fire that had nothing to do with fanaticism or ideology and everything to do with a well-trained regular infantry division, holding an almost perfectly designed defensive position. The defenders had range cards, overlapping fields of fire, pre-sited mortar concentrations. They had prepared this position as any professional soldiers would prepare a defensive position. And then the Americans came. What the defenders did not have, and this is where the strategic failure becomes personal, was any ability to exploit the situation. The German commanders watching the Americans pile up on Omaha Beach in those early hours couldn't do anything with the advantage they'd temporarily gained. There were no tanks, no reserve infantry, no counterattacking force that could have come down off those bluffs and driven a shaken landing force into the sea. The bunker crews could fire, and they fired well, and they inflicted terrible casualties. But a firing position is a static thing. It can hurt, but it cannot push. On the beaches where the defenses were lighter, Utah, Gold, Sword, the picture was different. The static divisions holding those sectors were lower quality formations with less combat experience, and the Allied preliminary bombardment, though famously less effective at Omaha, where the bombing overshot the beach, had in places suppressed or shocked the defenders enough to let the landings go in with manageable casualties. At Utah, the landing went almost smoothly by comparison. At Sword and Gold, British troops were ashore and moving inland within hours. The defenders were holding as long as they could. Some bunker crews kept firing until they were physically overrun. Others, isolated and without communications, surrendered when they realized the scope of what had happened. There's a particular detail in one account that I keep coming back to. Soldiers in their positions watching the sea horizon fill with ships and not being able to communicate clearly what they were. Seeing because the communications network was already degraded. The reports that made it up the chain were fragmentary. Large forces landing, that kind of thing. The precision that a commander needs to make decisions was not available at the moment it was most needed. Hitler slept in. By the time the sun had been up for several hours on the 6th of June, 1944, the situation along the Norman coast was already beyond recovery at the tactical level. The Allies were ashore. They were taking casualties, in some sectors, terrible casualties. But they were ashore and they weren't leaving. And at this exact moment, when the window for a decisive German response was closing by the hour, the panzer reserves that Rommel had wanted at the beach were sitting immobile north of Paris and in Brittany and in the south of France, waiting for authorization to move. The authorization had to come from Hitler. Hitler was asleep. His staff, deeply conditioned by years of experience with the consequences of waking him with bad news before he was ready, did not wake him. This is one of those moments that historians have argued about for decades, and, I'll be honest, I've argued with myself about it too. On one hand, the Panzer Reserve was never going to be able to reach the beaches and counterattack effectively in the first hours regardless of when it was released, given the distances involved and the Allied air umbrella that would have savaged any daylight column on French roads. Rommel himself had predicted this. Von Schweppenberg, who favored the centralized reserve concept, would later argue his forces could have been effective if released earlier. The debate is unresolved and probably unresolvable. What is not in dispute is the timing. Hitler woke. He was briefed. His initial reaction, according to German accounts, was confident, almost cheerful. He had been expecting this. He believed the Normandy landing was a feint, that the real blow was coming at the Pas de Calais, and that the correct response was to hold the centralized reserve until the main Allied effort revealed itself. Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception plan involving a fictitious army group stationed in southeastern England under the command of General George Patton, had done its work. German intelligence assessed Patton as the most dangerous Allied commander. If Patton wasn't committed to Normandy, then Normandy was the feint. This logic was completely consistent with the intelligence picture as the Germans understood it. It was also completely wrong. The armored divisions that were eventually released, and some were released on the 6th of June itself, though their lead elements wouldn't reach the front until the following day. Found exactly what Rommel had predicted when they tried to move by daylight. Allied fighter bombers, the Jabos as the German soldiers called them, made the roads a dangerous place to be. The 2 SS Panzer Division Das Reich, moving up from the south of France, was delayed by days through a combination of air attack and French resistance sabotage. The distance from their peacetime garrisons to the Normandy front was simply too great. By the time they arrived in numbers, the Allies had consolidated their beachhead sufficiently that a decisive counterattack had become a much larger, more complicated, and more expensive undertaking than it would have been at dawn on the 6th. The one panzer formation that did mount a counterattack on D-Day itself was the 21st Panzer Division, which spent the morning fighting British paratroopers east of the Orne River, got command authority transferred from Rommel's absent headquarters to General Marx of LXX I Corps, crossed the Orne, squeezed through Caen, and finally launched its attack north toward the Allied beachhead at around 16:20 hours, roughly 4 hours and 50 minutes after the beach landings had begun. Its attack was beaten back by British tanks and anti-tank guns on Perrier's Ridge. 15 of its tanks were lost in the first engagements. An element of its infantry actually reached the coast between Sword and Juno beaches, genuinely reached the sea, which by conventional military logic represented a success, and was then ordered to withdraw because a massive British glider reinforcement arriving at 9 in the evening appeared to threaten the division's rear. So the one German armored counterattack on D-Day reached the sea and then retreated. Not from cowardice, not from incompetence at the unit level, but because the situation made staying there untenable and the command judgment was made to pull back. General Erich Marx, the LXX Civiv Corps commander who'd been directing this desperate attempt to hold the invasion, reportedly told Colonel Hermann Oppeln Bronikowski before the tank attack, "If you don't succeed in throwing the British into the sea, we shall have lost the war." Oppeln led his tanks forward. The British held. The war was not reversed. Marx had one good leg. He'd lost the other on the Eastern Front. He drove his command vehicle hard along roads under air attack all through D-Day, holding together a fragmenting defensive line with the authority of a man who understood he was in a fight he probably couldn't win and was going to fight it anyway. He would be killed less than 2 weeks later, on the 12th of June, when his command vehicle was caught on an exposed road by Allied aircraft. But that is the next part of the story. For now, the 6th of June is over. The Germans are still in Normandy. The Allies are ashore. And what comes next is not a swift German collapse, but something far more protracted, far more costly, and in its own grim way, far more remarkable than the legend of D-Day usually allows for. The Green Maze. Fighting in the bocage. There's a particular kind of terrain that makes professional soldiers uneasy the moment they look at it on a map. Not mountains, not rivers, those are at least legible. The bocage of Normandy is something else. It is a landscape of small, irregularly shaped fields enclosed by earthen embankments, some of them nearly 2 meters high, each one topped with dense root systems and hedgerow growth that had been accumulating, in some cases, for centuries. The banks weren't just obstacles. They were walls, natural fortifications that required no engineer, no concrete, no planning. They had simply grown there, indifferent to anyone's tactical requirements, and they turned the Norman interior into a maze of interconnected green corridors where visibility extended roughly as far as the next hedgerow, which could be 10 meters away or 30. The Allied planners had known about the bocage. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed it clearly. What the photographs couldn't convey, what no photograph can convey, is the way terrain feels when you're moving through it at ground level. When the sun disappears above the canopy, overhead, and the field of fire shrinks to almost nothing, and you understand that the hedgerow directly in front of you could be holding anything. A German machine gun crew could set up at the base of one of those earthen banks, cut a small aperture in the roots, and command a 60-meter lane of fire with near-perfect concealment. The Allied soldiers who moved into this terrain in the days following D-Day discovered very quickly that a beach landing, for all its horror, at least made visual and tactical sense. The bocage made no tactical sense at all unless you were defending it. The German infantry divisions and, more critically, the armored and mechanized formations that arrived from reserve in the days following the 6th of June found the bocage gave them something they had almost no right to expect: time. Every hedgerow was a defensive line. Every sunken lane was an ambush corridor. Every Norman farmhouse was a potential strongpoint with walls thick enough to absorb small arms fire and mortar fragments without difficulty. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, a formation whose history I find genuinely difficult to approach without comment, because its membership was drawn largely from teenage volunteers raised on a specific ideology that I won't elaborate here, arrived in the Cannes sector within hours of the landings and found the bocage perfectly suited to what it needed to do: slow the Allied advance, hold ground, and buy time for heavier formations to arrive. It did that with terrifying effectiveness. The Panzer Lehr Division arrived by the 9th of June and took up positions west of the Hitlerjugend, opposing the British 50th Division around the town of Tilly-sur-Seulles. Panzer Lehr was an unusual formation. It had been built from demonstration and training units. The Lehr in its name means instruction, which meant that its tank crews and infantry were, on average, among the best trained in the German army. It was a showcase division in the most literal sense. When it arrived in Normandy, it had more armor and more experienced men per battalion than almost any other formation in the West. Its commander, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, had served as Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa. He knew how Allied air power worked. He'd watched it destroy columns in the Western Desert. And now, moving his division through the Norman road network under an almost continuous threat from Allied fighter bombers, he understood with a particular personal familiarity that his division was already being worn down before it fired a single shot in anger. The fighter bomber problem, the Jabo problem, as German soldiers consistently called it in their letters and diaries, was not merely a tactical inconvenience. It was a strategic constraint that shaped every German decision in Normandy after D-Day. Columns could not move in daylight without being attacked. Headquarters had to disperse and camouflage. Supply convoys moved at night, which meant they moved slowly, which meant the forward units went short of ammunition, fuel, and food. The German army in Normandy after the 6th of June was an army in a particular kind of siege. Not surrounded, not cut off in any conventional sense, but operationally strangled by a combination of air power and the destruction of the French rail network that had been underway since the spring. Bridges were down. Marshalling yards were rubble. Fuel moved by horse cart where it moved at all. And into this supply nightmare, the German High Command was being asked to mount a decisive armored counterattack that would throw the Allies back into the sea. This Bayerlein later described what the Jabo attacks did to Panzer Lehr during its approach march. He used words that were specific and technical. Losses of specific vehicle types, specific road junctions where columns were caught. And behind the technical language was the bleak acknowledgement that a division the German army had spent years and enormous resources building was being destroyed piecemeal on French country roads before it even reached the front. I've read versions of this account in secondary sources, and the specificity of the complaints is striking. This isn't a man rationalizing defeat after the fact. This is a man who understood logistics and air power, and who was watching his professional life's work dismantled from above. The bocage bought time. The Jabos canceled it. Allied progress through the bocage was, from the German perspective, agonizingly slow, and, from the Allied perspective, equally agonizing. Entire American battalions would spend a full day fighting through 2 or 3 field lengths of Norman countryside. Casualties accumulated. Units lost their experienced junior officers and sergeants. The men who knew how to move through close terrain, and the replacements who arrived didn't know yet, and the learning curve was measured in lives. The German defenders understood this dynamic perfectly well. Every hour they held a hedgerow was an hour the Allied buildup was slowed, the breakout delayed, the political pressure on Allied commanders increased. Time was the only strategic resource. Germany had left in the West by June of 1944, and the bocage was where time was manufactured. The Americans eventually solved the bocage problem with a piece of engineering so simple it's almost insulting. The Rhino device, welded from salvaged German beach obstacles and bolted to the front of Sherman tanks, which allowed them to cut through the base of hedgerow banks rather than climbing over the top, where they were silhouetted against the sky for a second or two, long enough for a German anti-tank gun to kill them. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 2nd Armored Division is credited in most accounts with the core idea. It took until roughly mid-July to produce and distribute the devices in numbers. Until then, the bocage simply ate formations alive, Allied and German both, in a grinding attritional battle that neither side had planned for and neither side could step back from. The casualty figures for the bocage campaign are ones I find it hard to present without pausing. American divisions that had come ashore on the 6th of June with full complements were, by late July, reporting effective strength fractions in their rifle companies that amounted to shadows of what they'd been. German infantry regiments holding the line were in comparable condition. One veteran's account, documented in a regimental history, describes looking along a defensive line that had held for 3 weeks and being unable to recognize more than a handful of faces from the original garrison. Everyone else was new or gone. The bocage was not a battle in any cinematic sense. It was an industrial process. What came out of those weeks, from the German side, was not defeat. Not yet. It was a kind of terrible competence. Small units holding positions they had no reason to still be holding, resupplied inadequately, under air attack, short of artillery ammunition because the supply system had been broken, and still holding. The German army in the bocage demonstrated something that its commanders in Berlin seemed not to fully appreciate: the fighting value of ordinary soldiers defending ground they'd been told to defend is extraordinarily hard to exhaust quickly, even when the operational and strategic situation is clearly and irreversibly lost. The men in the hedgerows didn't know the battle was lost. They only knew their hedgerow, and the next one, and the one after that. Cannes, the city that wouldn't fall Cannes, was supposed to fall on D-Day. That was the plan, or at least the aspiration. The British Second Army, landing on Sword Beach and pushing inland through the coastal towns, was meant to capture the city on the 6th of June, securing a southern anchor for the beachhead and opening ground for the rapid deployment of armored forces. It did not fall on D-Day. It did not fall for weeks, and the battle for Cannes became one of the most debated and in places most devastating engagements of the Normandy campaign. A prolonged siege of a medieval Norman city that reduced large portions of it to rubble and demonstrated in painful detail the limits of both Allied momentum and German defensive resolve. The 21st Panzer Division, as we've established, was already in the Cannes area on D-Day. By nightfall on the 6th of June, the lead elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend had arrived on its left flank and were facing the Canadian 3rd Division. Within 48 hours, the Germans had established coherent defensive lines south and east of Cannes that the British and Canadians found they could pressure but not break. The terrain helped the defenders. The road network around Cannes funneled Allied armor into predictable approach routes, and the German anti-tank screen, built around a combination of the 75mm guns of the Panzer IV, the long-barreled guns of the Panther, and the truly formidable 88mm guns of the Tiger Eye, made any straightforward armored advance into a very expensive undertaking. There is a particular difficulty in writing about the 12th SS in this context, and I want to address it directly rather than step around it. This was a division whose record in Normandy included both remarkable defensive fighting and documented atrocities against Allied prisoners of war, specifically Canadian prisoners, killed in the days following D-Day in incidents that were investigated after the war and led to prosecutions. I'm not going to detail those incidents here because that's not what this chapter is about, but I'm also not going to pretend they didn't happen, because they did. And any honest account of the 12th SS in Normandy has to hold both things simultaneously, that these soldiers fought with considerable tactical skill, and that some of them committed serious crimes. History doesn't resolve that contradiction neatly, and I won't try to. The British mounted multiple operations to take Caen and its surrounding terrain across June and into July. Operation Perch in mid-June aimed at encircling the city from the west. Operation Epsom at the end of June targeted the high ground southwest of Caen, known as Hill 112, a plateau of open farmland that commanded the entire surrounding area, and that both sides understood immediately was worth disproportionate effort to hold. Hill 112 changed hands multiple times. The fighting there was among the heaviest of the Normandy campaign. Not because of the hill's symbolic value, though commanders on both sides invested it with plenty of that, but because its geographic position made it a genuine operational asset. Whoever held it controlled observation and indirect fire over a substantial portion of the front. The 12th SS and Panzer Lehr between them held the Caen approaches through most of June, taking losses they couldn't replace while inflicting losses that the Allies, with their superior supply lines and reinforcement pipelines, could replace far more easily. This asymmetry, which the German commanders understood perfectly well and discussed in their operational reports with something approaching despair, was the structural reality of the Normandy campaign. After the first week, Germany was defending with a fixed hand of cards. The Allies were drawing fresh cards every day across the beaches that were now processing thousands of men and vehicles per day. The math was obvious to anyone who chose to look at it honestly. Field Marshal von Rundstedt looked at it honestly. In early July, he reportedly told Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the OKW, that the German position in Normandy was strategically untenable, and that the only sensible course was to seek a negotiated end to the war in the West. The phrasing varies across accounts, but the substance was the same. He was relieved of command on the 2nd of July, 1944. His replacement was Field Marshal Günther Hans von Kluge, who arrived with a reputation built in the East and immediately found himself in the same impossible position that had broken his predecessor. Von Kluge's honeymoon period with Hitler lasted roughly 2 weeks before he, too, was sending back reports that the situation was more serious than OKW's maps suggested. Caen itself fell, or rather, the ruins that had been Caen fell, in phases beginning on the 9th of July, when Operation Charnwood, supported by a massive aerial bombardment, allowed British and Canadian troops to enter the northern part of the city. The bombing had destroyed large sections of the city and killed a significant number of French civilians, a fact that was acknowledged at the time, and that remains a painful element of the Normandy campaign's legacy in France. The Germans held the southern part of Caen, across the Orne River, for weeks more. The city wasn't fully in Allied hands until the end of July. What the Allies found when they got there was not a functioning city. It was a field of rubble with streets still notionally present between the debris fields. Caen had been held, and the holding had cost it most of what made it a city worth holding. The German defenders who were pulled out of the Caen area in this period were formations that had been in continuous combat for weeks. The 12th SS, which had arrived in Normandy at nearly full strength, had by mid-July lost a substantial proportion of its Panthers and Panzer IVs, and a harder-to-quantify but clearly significant proportion of its experienced junior leadership. Armored divisions are not simple things to replace. A tank can be manufactured. The crew that knows how to use it in specific terrain against a specific enemy, after specific experiences, that takes years and cannot be shipped to the front in a box. The 12th SS would fight on. It would fight effectively by any reasonable measure. But it was never again the formation that had arrived at Caen on the 7th of June, 1944. The broader significance of Cannes, which has been argued about in operational history ever since, is that it pulled the bulk of Germany's armored strength onto the eastern end of the Allied beachhead. Every panzer division committed to defending Cannes was a panzer division not facing the Americans in the bocage to the west. Whether that was a deliberate British strategy, as Montgomery later claimed, or an emergent consequence of geography and German decision-making, as his critics argued, is a debate that hasn't entirely settled, and I find myself genuinely unsure which interpretation I believe. What's not in debate is the outcome. When the Americans finally broke through in the west in late July, the German line west of the beachhead was held largely by infantry without significant armor. The consequences were catastrophic. There's a kind of historical irony in Cannes that I keep turning over. The city was held so long, at such cost, for such strategic reasons, and in the end, the battle for it probably contributed to the conditions that made the entire German position in Normandy unrecoverable. The panzers stayed at Cannes. The American breakout happened without them. And the German army, which had demonstrated in 6 weeks of Normandy fighting a defensive capability that exceeded almost everyone's expectations, ran out of time to demonstrate it. Operation Goodwood. Steel and Earth, the 18th of July, 1944. 05:25 hours. A British artillery barrage opened on the German positions east and southeast of Cannes with a weight of fire that, by all accounts, on both sides, was like nothing anyone had experienced in Western Europe to that point. Then came the aircraft, roughly 4,500 heavy and medium bombers, a number I want you to sit with for a moment, because it is genuinely extraordinary, struck a corridor of German-held ground roughly 6 kilometers wide and 15 deep in sequential waves that lasted several hours. The ground shook in a radius of tens of kilometers from the target area. In villages well behind the German lines, civilians reported that the vibration was physically felt through the floors of their cellars. What Montgomery was launching was Operation Goodwood, and what he intended, or what he later claimed he intended, depending on which version of events you find more credible, was a massive armored thrust south of Cannes that would either achieve a strategic breakthrough toward Falaise and the open country beyond, or at minimum, draw German armor into a grinding battle that would finally exhaust the Panzer Reserve. 3 British armored divisions, the 7th, the Guards, and the 11th, were to pass through a narrow corridor east of the Orne and then swing south across the Borgebus Ridge. It was the largest concentration of Allied armor in the Normandy campaign to that point. Nearly 1,000 tanks, assembled in a British fist to be driven through the German line. The German position that morning was built in depth, in a way that the British bombardment, for all its violence, could not fully destroy. The German defensive system here had layers. Frontline positions, anti-tank gun scenes dug in at successive ridge lines, and reserve armored counterattack elements positioned several kilometers behind the main line. The heavy Tiger tanks of the 10th and 102nd SS Heavy Panzer Battalions were positioned at the Borgebus Ridge itself. Not at the front, where the bombing would have found them, but behind it, hull down and waiting. This wasn't luck. It was deliberate deployment by German commanders who had watched the pattern of Allied preparatory bombardments often enough to understand that the way to survive them was to be somewhere the bombardment wasn't aimed. The German frontline positions absorbed the bombing, the survivors. And there were survivors, some of them pulled from their positions physically disoriented, concussed, in states that the medical literature of the time didn't have precise language for, but that we would now recognize as severe acute stress responses, manned their positions as the first British tanks came through. Many of those front-line strongpoints were overrun. The bombing had done enough. The first phase of the British advance moved with apparent momentum, and then the advance ran into the anti-tank screens at the intermediate ridge lines, and the momentum stopped. The 88th Anti-Aircraft Gun, the 88mm flak gun redeployed in the anti-tank role, was one of those pieces of German military technology that, even accounting for the propaganda around it, genuinely deserves its reputation. Its muzzle velocity gave it an effective anti-tank range that exceeded the maximum effective range of most British tank guns in service in 1944. A Tiger I, hull down on the Bourgaboos Ridge with an 88 behind it, was capable of killing a Sherman at ranges that made returning fire almost futile. The British tank crews knew this. They knew what it meant to crest a ridge in a Sherman against a Panzer IV or Tiger with height advantage. They did it anyway, because there was nothing else to do. The losses on the Bourgaboos Ridge on the 18th of July were among the worst suffered by British armor in the entire campaign. By the end of Goodwood's first day, the 11th Armored Division had lost roughly 126 tanks, a figure that appears in multiple operational histories and which I want to contextualize. That is not a formation with a few burned-out vehicles at the margin. That is the effective destruction of a large portion of a full armored division's striking power in a single day. The Guards' Armored Division had suffered comparable losses. The Germans, defending from prepared positions with the terrain advantage, had absorbed an operation of extraordinary weight and had not broken. They had bent considerably. The front had moved southward, but the ridge held, and without the ridge, the breakthrough to open country did not materialize. What I find genuinely strange about Goodwood, and what I think is under discussed in the popular accounts, is what it cost the Germans even in victory. The panzer formations defending the Bourgaboos Ridge had fought hard and fought effectively, but they had used ammunition at rates that the German supply system was increasingly unable to sustain. The Tiger companies that had been so effective on the 18th were reporting reduced operational strength within days, as mechanical wear, ammunition expenditure, and the slow accumulation of crew casualties took their toll. Replacing a Tiger I that broke down required spare parts that came by rail from Germany, on a rail network that Allied bombers were systematically destroying. Some Tigers that were immobilized in Normandy never moved again. Not because they'd been hit, but because the part they needed couldn't be delivered in time. The strategic consequence of Goodwood. Leaving aside the intense argument about what Montgomery intended versus what he told Eisenhower he intended, was to confirm the pattern that had been evident since D-Day. British and Canadian forces were tying down the bulk of German armor around Caen, while the Americans in the West finished developing their own breakthrough operation. The German command in Normandy understood this dynamic but was helpless to change it. Pulling panzers from Caen to reinforce the West would immediately expose Caen to a British breakthrough that could cut off the entire German force. Keeping them at Caen meant watching the western sector slowly stripped of armor and left with infantry divisions that couldn't stop an American armored breakout. It was a trap, and the jaws were closing. Rommel had submitted a formal report to Hitler shortly before Goodwood, dated the 15th of July, 1944. That was as close to an ultimatum as a field marshal of the German army could safely send to his Führer. The document, which survives in German military archives, described the situation in direct terms. The troops were fighting heroically, losses were unsustainable, reinforcements were inadequate, and the overall military situation in the West was deteriorating toward a crisis that could not be resolved by continued fighting alone. It was as close as Rommel ever came, on the record, to telling Hitler the war in the West was lost. 2 days after the report was written, on the 17th of July, Rommel's staff car was attacked by Allied fighter bombers near Livorno. The car crashed. Rommel suffered severe head injuries and was evacuated. He never returned to command. The German army in Normandy had just lost the one field commander, who both understood the ground, understood Allied air power from personal experience, and had enough personal authority and reputation to push back against OKW with some chance of being heard. His replacement, von Kluge, was a capable general, but he was new to this theater, new to this specific terrain, and was navigating an institutional environment. The relationship between the Normandy command and Hitler's headquarters, that Rommel himself had found almost unmanageable, even with a decade of accumulated personal credibility with the Führer. Von Kluge didn't have that credibility. He also, as would soon become apparent, had other problems. His name had been mentioned in connection with the conspiracy against Hitler that was about to come to a head. July of 1944 was not a good month to be a senior German commander. The July plot and the army that fought on. On the 20th of July, 1944, a briefcase bomb exploded in a conference room at the Wolf's Chance, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's eastern headquarters in what is now northeastern Poland. The man who placed it there was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a decorated officer of the German General Staff who had lost his right hand, 2 fingers of his left hand, and his left eye on the Eastern Front, and who had concluded with cold clarity that the only way to end the war before Germany was completely destroyed was to remove Hitler and negotiate with the Western Allies. He had moved the briefcase as close to Hitler as circumstances allowed and then left the room. A subsequent movement of the briefcase by another officer in the crowded room, inadvertent, documented, shifted it behind a heavy table leg. Hitler survived. Stauffenberg was arrested and executed the same night. I want to be careful here about what this chapter is and isn't about, because the July 20th plot is a deep subject with its own literature and its own moral complexity. What I want to focus on is what it meant for the German army in Normandy, specifically, the consequences of the failed plot on an army that was already in a desperate operational situation. The immediate effect was a wave of arrests, interrogations, and executions that reached into the senior levels of the German command structure in the West. Von Kluge's name was known to the Gestapo in connection with earlier conspiracy discussions, though the extent of his actual involvement is still debated by historians. He was watched. He was suspected. He was a man trying to command an army group in crisis while simultaneously aware that the security apparatus of his own government was investigating him. General Erich Hoepner, General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben. These were the names of men executed in the aftermath of the failed plot. Some were hanged by deliberate degradation with piano wire rather than rope. The proceedings against them were filmed. The broader message to the officer corps was unmistakable. Loyalty would be enforced, and the mechanism of enforcement was explicit. For the officers still commanding in Normandy, this was not an abstraction. These were men they knew, in some cases, men they'd served with. The institutional atmosphere of the German army after the 20th of July was one in which individual initiative, independent judgment, and frank reporting upward became even more dangerous than they'd already been. The specific effect on Normandy was that just as the situation was reaching its most critical point, just as American breakout operations were building to their climax, and the German line in the West was approaching collapse, the German command structure was being simultaneously subjected to internal purge and external pressure. Von Kluge was receiving orders from Hitler that bore no relationship to operational reality on the ground, and he was following them because the alternative, the kind of honest pushback that Rommel had practiced, was now even more personally dangerous than it had been before the 20th of July. The Normandy campaign in its final phase was not simply a military defeat. It was also an institutional catastrophe, a chain of decisions made by men under a specific kind of duress that has no exact parallel in modern military history. There are German soldiers' accounts, letters written home in July of 1944, that reflect something of this atmosphere without explicitly stating it. The tone shifts. The confident assessments of early June, the expectation that the Atlantic Wall would hold, the belief that a counterattack was coming, those had disappeared by mid-July. What replaced them was a more careful kind of writing, the kind you produce when you're uncertain who might read what you've written before it reaches its intended recipient. Some letters say nothing about the military situation at all. Some focus entirely on domestic details, the harvest, the weather at home, the health of family members, in a way that reads, in retrospect, as deliberate avoidance. The sensors were still active. The security services were still reading. And a soldier who wrote honestly about what he was seeing in July of 1944 was writing something that could get him shot. For the ordinary soldiers in the Bocage and around Cannes and in the static divisions, holding the flanks of the German line, the 20th of July and its aftermath were mostly distant noise. What was not distant was the growing shortages. Ammunition rations for artillery had been cut significantly by mid-July. Infantry units were being told to conserve mortar rounds, a weapon whose value in Bocage fighting was enormous and whose conservation in that context was a bit like telling a carpenter to conserve nails. Fuel was rationed in ways that limited vehicle mobility at exactly the moment when mobile defense was the only viable operational concept left. And reinforcements, when they came, in the form of individual replacements, folded into depleted units rather than fresh formations, which meant that the experience level, the unit cohesion, the specific institutional knowledge that makes a military formation more effective than a collection of armed individuals, was continuously diluting. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in Normandy were, by the third week of July, armies that were still fighting effectively at the small unit level and that were failing at every other level simultaneously. Supply was failing. Command coordination was failing. Strategic direction from OKW was failing, issuing orders that bore increasingly tenuous connections to what was actually possible in the field. The soldiers in the hedgerows and bunkers and ruined Norman towns didn't know all of this, or knew it only in fragments. Through the evidence of their own experience, less food, less ammunition, fewer friends still present at roll call. War communicates its own situation reports to the people living inside it, regardless of what the official communications say. What kept those soldiers fighting, and they did keep fighting, into August, into the Falaise encirclement, and beyond, is something that military historians have analyzed from multiple angles. Unit cohesion, the most durable of military social bonds. The specific German infantry culture of the Lancers, ordinary soldiers who'd been trained in a tradition of holding ground that went back through the First World War and earlier. The awareness that the alternative to fighting was either capture or movement eastward plunder through a Germany that was itself coming under increasing pressure. And in some units, particularly the SS formations, an ideological dimension that I won't minimize, but also won't place at the center of the explanation. Because the documentary evidence suggests that for most ordinary soldiers, ideology had substantially less to do with continued fighting than simple unit loyalty and the immediate social dynamics of men under pressure together. The July plot and its aftermath are a reminder that the German military experience in Normandy was not simply a story of soldiers against soldiers. It was a story of soldiers against soldiers inside a political structure that was simultaneously consuming itself within an operational situation that was deteriorating beyond recovery, sustained by logistics that were breaking, under air power they couldn't see before it struck, and increasingly aware. In the particular way, soldiers become aware of such things without being told directly that the war they were being asked to keep fighting was a war that had been lost at a level above them by decisions made before they even got to France. The breakout, Operation Cobra, and the line that broke. I want to tell you about the 25th of July, 1944. And I want to tell it slowly, because it was one of those days where the cumulative weight of everything that had gone before finally produced a result that changed the character of the entire campaign, indeed, of the entire war in the West. General Omar Bradley's 1st United States Army had been preparing Operation Cobra for weeks. The concept was to concentrate American air power on a narrow stretch of the German line west of Saint-Lô, the Perrier-Saint-Lô road serving as the bomb line, and then push armor and infantry through the resulting gap before the German defenders could reorganize. The American sector was held largely by German infantry divisions without significant armored support, a direct consequence of those armored formations being pinned around Cayenne. And the bocage there, while still formidable, was terrain the Americans had learned, at great cost, how to fight through. What happened on the 25th of July was approximately 2,400 Allied aircraft delivering roughly 4,000 tons of bombs on a rectangle of German-held Normandy, roughly 6 kilometers wide and 3 deep. It was the largest concentration of air power in a tactical ground support role that had yet been attempted in the war. It was also, by grim coincidence, responsible for killing American soldiers through short bombing, the bombs falling on American positions south of the bomb line in a tragedy that killed, among others, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. I note this not to dwell on it, but because it matters to the honest account. Even the operation that cracked the German line was not clean, and the men who launched it paid a price for it. On the German side, what Cobra did to the units holding that sector is documented in both American after-action reports and the fragmentary German records that survived. The Panzer Division, which had been in continuous combat since arriving in Normandy, and which was now holding this stretch of front with a fraction of its original strength, was essentially destroyed as an organized formation in a matter of hours. Bearline's own account describes the scene in terms that don't require dramatization. Headquarters overrun, communications cut, the division's remaining tanks either destroyed or unable to move, through roads choked with bomb craters and collapsed hedgerow debris. The few dozen men who were still operational after the bombing were in no condition to hold a line against the American armor and infantry that began moving through at approximately 1100 hours. The American armor that poured through the gap in the German line moved not at the pace of bocage fighting, measured in fields and hedgerows, but at the pace of pursuit. Roads appeared. Open country appeared. The Shermans and the tank destroyers and the motorized infantry found themselves moving through Normandy at a rate that neither side had experienced in weeks. And the German command, receiving reports of this movement, faced a situation they had no prepared response to, because the prepared response, the armored counterattack, the mobile reserve, the strategic redeployment, had all been committed, depleted, or paralyzed by the accumulated events of the preceding 7 weeks. General Omar Bradley described what he saw from his command aircraft over the American advance with barely contained excitement. The German line hadn't bent, it had broken. The distinction is operational and significant. A bent line reforms and slows the advance. A broken line creates exploitation corridors that become self-reinforcing, because every kilometer of advance makes the neighboring German positions untenable and forces further retreats, which expose further flanks, and so on in a cascade that is almost impossible to arrest once it has fully developed. Patton's Third Army was activated on the 1st of August, and within days it was sweeping around the open German flank with a speed that left German commanders receiving situation reports they literally did not believe, because the reports were describing American forces in places where, by any rational calculation of march rate and road capacity, they could not yet be. The German response, ordered by Hitler, implemented reluctantly by von Kluge, was the Mortain counterattack of the 7th of August, Operation Lüttich. 4 depleted panzer divisions, assembled with difficulty from across the German line, were ordered to drive west from Mortain and cut the American supply corridor to the breakthrough forces. The intention was operationally logical in the narrow sense that if successful, it would have severed the logistical lifeline of Patton's armored thrust. But the forces available were insufficient. The Allied intelligence services had broken German communications in sufficient detail to warn Bradley's headquarters hours before the attack began. And the attack went in without the air cover it needed, because the Luftwaffe simply did not have sufficient strength to provide it. The Mortain attack was stopped within roughly 24 hours by a combination of American ground resistance and the relentless work of Allied fighter bombers against the panzer columns. Von Kluge knew the Mortain attack had failed almost immediately. He knew what it meant. He knew that by committing those panzer forces westward in the counterattack. He had thinned the German line to the south and east, precisely where the British and Canadians were now pushing south from Caen in Operation Totalize. The map was doing what maps do when two converging enemy forces are drawn on them, showing a pocket, a large, roughly oval space where the German 7th Army and much of the 5th Panzer Army were operating, with American forces curling around from the west and south and British and Canadian forces pushing from the north. The word encirclement was beginning to appear in German operational documents. By the middle of August, the pocket was real. Its southern exit, the gap between the town of Falaise, held by Canadian and Polish forces, and the American forces pushing up from Argentan, was narrowing by the day. German units inside the pocket were ordered to hold and told that relief was coming. Some commanders believed it. Others sent back reports that were as close to honest as the climate of the German High Command in the summer of 1944 allowed. Von Kluge, driving to the front on the 15th of August for reasons that remain somewhat unclear, was out of contact with his headquarters for several hours. Instantly, Hitler suspected treason, suspected that von Kluge was attempting to make contact with the Americans. Whether that was true or not, von Kluge was relieved on the 17th of August. His replacement was Field Marshal Walter Model. On his way home to Germany, von Kluge took a capsule of cyanide. The pocket at Falaise. An army dissolves. The Falaise pocket is one of those episodes of the Second World War that doesn't fit comfortably into any single narrative frame. It was a decisive Allied victory. It was also, at the human level, one of the most terrible things that happened in Western Europe in the entire war. A large body of men compressed into a shrinking space, under continuous air and artillery attack, trying to get out through a gap that was closing around them. I approach it with the awareness that what happened at Falaise was not the death of an idea or an institution, but the death of a very large number of human beings, and the near death of thousands more, and that those facts deserve acknowledgement before the operational analysis begins. The pocket, by the 12th of August, contained the bulk of the German 7th Army and significant elements of the 5th Panzer Army. By some estimates, between 75,000 and 100,000 German soldiers, along with the vehicles, artillery, horses, and supplies of what had been, 6 weeks earlier, a serious defensive force. The Canadian 1st Army was pushing south from Caen toward Falaise. The American 1st Army had looped around to Argentan in the south. The gap between them, the corridor through which the Germans could still escape eastward, was roughly 15 to 20 kilometers wide at its maximum. It was narrowing. The German High Command's handling of the Falaise situation was shaped by the same institutional dysfunction that had characterized the entire Normandy campaign. Hitler ordered the pocket defended from the inside, ordered counterattacks to reopen it from the outside, and issued instructions that bore an increasingly tenuous relationship to what the forces available could actually do. Model, newly arrived, was an officer of real ability who had demonstrated a genuine talent for defensive operations on the Eastern Front. But the Eastern Front had been a different kind of war, a war with the depth to trade space for time, with a supply system that was broken but not absent, with forces that were depleted but not encircled. Falaise was not that. Falaise was a collapsing perimeter with no depth to trade and no time left to buy. The soldiers inside the pocket were not a coherent force anymore in any operational sense. They were fragments. Remnants of divisions that had been fighting continuously since June, mixed in with rear area service troops who'd been swept up in the retreat, with headquarters elements that had lost their subordinate commands, with isolated combat groups that had improvised their own local command structures when the official ones stopped functioning. The roads inside the pocket were under continuous air attack during daylight. Movement was possible mainly at night, which meant it was slow and disorganized and consumed what fuel remained. Units that ran out of fuel abandoned their vehicles and continued on foot or on the hundreds of horses that the German army, far less mechanized than its Allied counterpart, still used for logistics. I want to be specific about the horses, because they tend to disappear from the standard accounts. The German army in 1944 used horses in enormous numbers for supply transport, artillery movement, and general logistics. The Falaise pocket was full of horses, thousands of them, and what happened to them in the closing days of the pocket is documented in the accounts of Allied soldiers who drove through afterward, and in the memoirs of German survivors. It is not pleasant. I raise it not for the sake of the detail itself, but because it illustrates something important about the nature of the German military machine that popular imagination often misses. It was in many respects a 19th-century logistical system carrying a 20th-century fighting capability. And when the operational situation became acute, the 19th century showed through. The gap closed progressively through the third week of August. Canadian and Polish forces from the north and American forces from the south fought toward each other across terrain already devastated by weeks of battle. The German forces trying to hold the escape corridor open were fighting in what military historians call a forlorn hope engagement. Defensive actions sustained not because they could succeed strategically, but because each additional hour the corridor remained open was an additional hour during which men could get through. Some estimates suggest that somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 German soldiers managed to escape through the Falaise Gap before it was finally closed. The numbers are uncertain. The German records from inside the pocket were largely destroyed or never properly compiled in the chaos, but the general picture is consistent. A substantial fraction escaped, and a very large fraction did not. The Allied armies that closed the pocket found what one Allied general described, in language that has been quoted many times and that I won't reproduce here, as a scene of comprehensive destruction. The vehicles, the artillery, the horses, the equipment of most of two German armies lay in the fields and roads between Falaise and Chambois. Around 50,000 Germans were taken prisoner in the closing of the pocket. German losses in killed, wounded, captured, and missing across the entire Normandy campaign from D-Day to the closing of the pocket were enormous. Figures cited in various historical works range from 200,000 to 300,000. Though the exact count is complicated by the chaotic record-keeping of a collapsing army. The German army in the West had been, if not destroyed, then fundamentally broken as an organized force capable of sustained defense in France. By the 25th of August, Paris was liberated. By the 30th, the last German units had crossed the Seine, and the Battle of Normandy was effectively over. The men who had stood in the concrete bunkers on the 6th of June, who had watched the horizon fill with ships, who had held their positions through the bombing and the bocage and the relentless Allied pressure, those who had survived, were somewhere east of the Seine in a retreat that would continue, with stops and counterattacks and the occasional desperate defensive success all the way to the German border and beyond. They had not broken easily. They had not broken quickly. The story that unfolds from here, through the autumn defensive battles, the Ardennes counteroffensive, the slow grinding Allied advance into Germany itself, is built on the same foundations as Normandy. Ordinary men, holding ground they'd been told to hold, in an institutional structure that had failed them operationally and morally, fighting on long after the strategic outcome was settled. The retreat. An army coming apart at the seams. There is a particular kind of military movement that doesn't appear in the training manuals, or rather it appears only as the thing to be avoided. The disorderly retreat under pursuit. It has its own internal logic, its own momentum, its own gravity, and once it begins at scale, it is extraordinarily difficult to arrest. Because the act of retreating, when it becomes visible to enough people simultaneously, produces its own compound fear. By the last days of August 1944, the German army in France was experiencing this dynamic in full. What had crossed the Seine was not, in any meaningful operational sense, an army. It was the surviving fragments of an army, men who had walked, driven, ridden horses, or simply run away from the collapsing pocket at Falaise, who had crossed the river by whatever means presented themselves, and who were now east of the scene in various states of exhaustion, equipment loss, and organizational dissolution. The scale of the materiel losses at Falaise and in the subsequent retreat to the Seine is worth understanding precisely, because it tells you something about the operational condition of what arrived at the German border that autumn. From the 1st of June to the 31st of August, German forces on all fronts lost more than 4,000 tanks and assault guns. Across the Normandy campaign specifically, the German army in the west lost approximately 2,300 tanks and self-propelled guns, along with tens of thousands of wheeled and half-tracked vehicles, and enough artillery pieces to equip several fresh divisions from scratch. The horse-drawn supply columns that had sustained forward units throughout the Bocage fighting were largely gone. Horses don't survive well under air attack, and the roads between Falaise and the Seine had been under almost continuous air attack for days. What did get across the Seine was, in certain respects, more important than the equipment figures suggest. The critical cadre, the experienced junior officers, the veteran sergeants, the tank commanders who'd fought since North Africa or the Eastern Front, the infantry squad leaders who knew instinctively how to use dead ground and when to hold and when to move. A significant fraction of these men made it out. This matters because military formations, in the view of most serious military historians, are rebuilt around experienced men rather than around equipment. A fresh Tiger I tank without a crew that knows how to use it is a large, expensive target. An experienced crew in an obsolete tank is a genuine fighting capability. The German army that limped east across the Seine in late August of 1944 was stripped of almost everything, except the one thing that ultimately would allow it to reconstitute. However temporarily, the professional core of an army that had been fighting continuously since 1939. The men themselves, in their letters, and in the accounts that survivors gave after the war, describe the retreat in terms that are almost hallucinatory in their detail. The roads were choked. The distinction between organized unit movements and individual soldiers trying to move in the same direction had collapsed. Officers who tried to establish order found themselves directing men from 4 or 5 different divisions who'd been separated from their own commands and were simply moving east, because east was away from the Americans. There were moments of unit cohesion, small groups that kept together, that maintained a degree of tactical integrity even in the chaos. But these were islands in a general flood of disorganization. Field police set up control points to direct traffic and catch deserters, and the presence of those control points is itself evidence of how serious the disorganization had become, because field police control points are a measure deployed when normal unit discipline has stopped functioning on its own. The physical condition of the men who emerged from the Falaise pocket was documented by Allied intelligence personnel who processed the prisoners, and there were many thousands of prisoners taken at the pocket and along the roads afterward. They were thin, consistently thin, in a way that spoke to weeks of inadequate supply rather than days. Many were without proper boots, an extraordinary detail for a military operation in its 3rd month, but one that appears in multiple sources and that reflects the complete breakdown of the German supply system by August of 1944. Unit morale assessments, compiled by Allied intelligence, describe men who were not broken ideologically. Many of them were still willing to express loyalty to Germany, if not always to the specific regime, but who were physically depleted in ways that compromised their ability to function as soldiers. The distinction matters. These weren't men who had given up believing in something. They were men who had been eaten alive by an operational situation that gave them nothing and took everything. The question of desertion in this period is one that requires care, because the German army's approach to desertion in 1944 was increasingly lethal. The summary execution of men found without their units, or found moving in the wrong direction, was documented and was in part an institutional response to precisely the kind of organizational dissolution that the Falaise retreat represented. The threat worked, in the narrow sense that it kept many men in their positions who might otherwise have left. It also introduced a specific kind of fear into the German army's internal atmosphere. Not the fear of the enemy, but the fear of your own side. That is corrosive in ways that are hard to quantify, but that every serious study of military effectiveness identifies as damaging. Men who stay in position because they're more afraid of being shot by their own people than by the enemy are not the same soldiers as men who stay because they believe in what they're doing. They perform the same function for a while. And then, when the situation becomes acute enough, they stop. The route of retreat through France also brought the German soldiers through towns and villages whose populations had a very specific view of them. And here the human texture of the retreat becomes something I find genuinely moving and complicated in equal measure. French civilians who'd lived under German occupation for 4 years were watching the same army that had administered, and in places terrorized, their communities now streaming past their windows in the direction of the border. Some accounts describe scenes of indifference, some describe scenes of taunting, some describe simple watching, the blank assessment of people who've learned not to express their feelings too openly because they've spent 4 years being punished for it. The German soldiers moving through these villages were, to the people watching them, simultaneously the object of 4 years of accumulated grievance and a collection of obviously exhausted, obviously beaten young men who didn't look like the masters of Europe anymore. The logistics of the retreat were handled with impressive improvisation by German staff officers who had very little to work with. Fuel was the binding constraint. A tank without fuel is a steel obstacle. Vehicles that ran out of fuel were pushed to the roadside, disabled if time permitted, abandoned if it didn't, and the crews continued on foot or squeezed onto whatever was still moving. The German military tradition of individual initiative at junior levels, the Auftragstaktik, the mission command philosophy that gave small unit leaders latitude to solve problems without waiting for orders, served these men reasonably well in the chaos of the retreat, precisely because it had trained officers and sergeants to function without continuous communication upward and downward. Men who'd been trained to assess the situation and act accordingly did, under conditions that would have paralyzed forces trained to wait for permission. They got across the Seine, many more than should have managed it, given the situation. By the first week of September, the leading elements of the retreating German army had reached the West Wall. The West Wall, which the Allies called the Siegfried Line, the defensive fortifications along Germany's western border that had been built in the late 1930s, neglected during the years of victory in the early war, and were now being frantically remanned with whatever forces could be scraped together. The installations were there, the bunkers, the Dragon's Teeth anti-tank obstacles, the prepared fighting positions. What wasn't there? Yet were adequate numbers of trained men to fill them. Ammunition stocks, working communications, and command structures that connected the men in the bunkers to the headquarters now, trying to reconstitute German defensive capacity from essentially nothing. But, and this is the part that surprised the Allies and has surprised many students of the campaign since, the German army managed it. Not fully, not everywhere, but sufficiently to slow the Allied advance at a moment when Allied supply lines were themselves stretched past their design parameters. The men who arrived at the West Wall were, in the most immediate sense, fortunate. They were still alive. Behind them they'd left France, and within France, in places that already had names. Omaha Beach, Hill 112, Villers-Bocage Falaise, the crossroads at Mortain. They'd left the better part of the German army's offensive capability and a large fraction of the irreplaceable experienced soldiers who'd made it function. The wall at the edge of Germany was concrete and steel like the other one. The question was whether the men who manned it still had enough in them to make it mean anything. The West Wall and the first winter September of 1944 is one of those moments in the European war where the operational picture was genuinely ambiguous. Not the clean narrative of unstoppable Allied advance that the post-war accounts sometimes imply, but a moment of contingency where Allied overextension and German reconstitution produced an unexpected stalemate along a line that neither side quite predicted would hold. The German army at the West Wall was rebuilding from the wreckage of France that surprised Allied intelligence and, in retrospect, surprised many German commanders too. Field Marshal Model, who'd taken over from the poisoned von Kluge, had a reputation on the Eastern Front for stabilizing broken lines through sheer force of organizational will, and he applied that skill to the Western situation with considerable effect. The West Wall, the Siegfried Line, was a chain of roughly 18,000 bunkers, pillboxes, and prepared positions extending approximately 630 kilometers from the Dutch border south to the Swiss frontier. The obstacles in front of it, concrete dragon's teeth anti-tank barriers, wire, minefields, prepared inundation zones, had been installed in the late 1930s when Germany was building the wall as a genuine deterrent to French attack. By 1944, some of the weapons originally designed for those installations had been removed and sent east. The guns were gone from some bunkers, leaving concrete shells that still provided cover and observation, but lacked the teeth they'd been designed to have. German engineers worked frantically through September to restore what could be restored and improvise what couldn't. The manpower filling those positions was a collection that reflected the German Army's desperate late-war recruitment. Volksgrenadier divisions. People's Grenadier Divisions, a designation introduced in the summer of 1944 for formations that were essentially rebuilt from the ground up with a mix of survivors, transferred Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine ground personnel, and conscripts younger or older than the previously standard draft age range. These weren't elite formations, but they had the West Wall behind them and, critically, they were on German soil, or very nearly on it, defending against an Allied army whose supply lines stretched back to Normandy beaches that were now 300 or more kilometers to the west. The logistics math had shifted. For the first time since June, the Germans were closer to their supply depots than their enemies were to theirs. The Battle of Aachen, the first German city to be entered by Allied forces, began in early October 1944 and lasted roughly 19 days. Aachen was ancient. It had been the seat of Charlemagne's empire, the first historical Reich in German national consciousness, and Hitler had ordered it defended to the last. The garrison defending it was a mix of regular infantry and Volkssturm, the home guard units of older men and boys that were beginning to appear in the German defensive order of battle in this period. The fighting inside the city was the kind of close-quarters urban combat that both sides found grinding and costly. Building by building, room by room, the Americans pushing inward and the German defenders falling back into Selisa and rubble fields that offered cover for small groups to hold positions far longer than their numbers would suggest. The city's civilian population had been ordered to evacuate. Many had, but many hadn't, and they lived in their cellars through the fighting in conditions that are documented in American Soldier accounts and in the post-war testimony of survivors. Aachen surrendered on the 21st of October, 1944. The German commander, Colonel Gerhard Wilk, surrendered to American forces rather than die in the ruins, which was the order he'd been given. This act of surrender, formally ending resistance in a city Hitler had designated as a symbolic hold to the last position, was used in Allied propaganda as evidence of the German army's failing will. It was somewhat more complicated than that. Units elsewhere on the West Wall line were still fighting effectively and would continue to do so. The German army's capacity for resistance had not collapsed. It had contracted, pulled back into a smaller space with shorter supply lines and the genuine emotional leverage of being on home soil. There's documentary evidence from this period that fighting quality actually improved in some units once they crossed into Germany proper. Not because the strategic situation had improved, but because the motivational calculus had changed. These men weren't defending France anymore. They were defending the country where their families lived. The autumn of 1944 was, for the ordinary German soldier in the West, a period of profound psychological complexity. The letters home from this period, those that survive, those that made it through the increasingly disrupted postal system, carry a quality that is different from the letters of earlier years and even of the summer. The confidence is gone entirely. So is the careful optimism of the hedgerow period, where men had been uncertain but not yet desperate. What replaces it is, in many cases, a kind of compressed focus on immediate details. The quality of food this week, the weather, the specific individuals in the unit who were still present and, therefore, alive. The letters read, to me, like documents produced by people who have narrowed their horizon of concern to what they can actually see and touch, because the larger picture, which they understood, at some level with growing clarity, was too painful to write about and possibly too dangerous. The broader German civilian population in the autumn of 1944 was experiencing its own version of this horizon narrowing. Allied bombing of German cities had been intensifying throughout the year, and the populations of Cologne, Hamburg, Dusseldorf, and dozens of smaller cities had already experienced the destruction of significant portions of their urban fabric. The flow of refugees from bombed-out cities into the surrounding countryside had created social pressures that the German administrative system was handling with decreasing effectiveness. Food rationing was tighter, fuel was scarcer. The propaganda system, Goebbels's operation, still running at full creative capacity, was producing material that an increasing number of Germans privately assessed as disconnected from their daily reality, even if expressing that assessment publicly remained dangerous. The German army that held the West Wall through the autumn did so against an Allied advance that had, by October, genuinely outrun its supply system. Operation Market Garden's failure in the Netherlands in September had closed off the option of a rapid envelopment through the north. The port of Antwerp, captured by British forces in early September, couldn't be properly used until German forces defending the shelled estuary were cleared, a campaign that took until November. Without Antwerp, the Allied supply situation remained critical. The front stabilized not only because the Germans had reorganized and were fighting on home soil, but because the Allied logistics system simply couldn't sustain the momentum of the August breakout. Both sides spent the autumn preparing for what came next. The Germans prepared a major offensive. The Allies prepared for a winter campaign that they expected to be slow and grinding. Only one of those assessments proved correct. The Ardennes Offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, launched in December of 1944, is a story that deserves its own documentary, and it will get one. What I want to observe here, in the context of this larger story, is what the offensive represented from the German perspective. It was not a spontaneous recovery of strength. It was a gathering of the last significant armored reserves available on the Western Front and the expenditure of most of those reserves in a single high-stakes gamble that Hitler ordered. Over the objections of virtually every senior commander who knew the actual state of the forces involved. The men who attacked through the Ardennes in the early hours of the 16th of December were, in many cases, veterans of Normandy, survivors of the Bocage and Caen and Falaise and the retreat across France. Now issued equipment that had been scraped together with enormous difficulty from production facilities that were themselves being targeted by Allied bombers. They attacked with genuine skill. They achieved initial surprise. And then the weather cleared. The Allied air forces came back, and the mathematics of the situation. More Allied tanks, more Allied fuel, more Allied replacements, shorter Allied supply lines than the German offensive had assumed, reasserted itself. By January of 1945, the Ardennes salient had been flattened, and the German army in the west had lost the last reserves it had available for offensive action. What remained was the final defensive campaign, the retreat into Germany itself, the crossing of the Rhine, and the end. That end came on the 8th of May, 1945, when the German instrument of unconditional surrender was signed. The Atlantic Wall had been built and breached, and the army that defended it had fought through France and back to its own borders and past them, and now it was over. The war in the West had lasted roughly 11 months from D-Day to the surrender. It had cost, on all sides, casualties that even the most precise military historians are reluctant to state as a clean number because the data is too fragmented, the definitions too variable, the losses too distributed across too many categories: killed, wounded, prisoner, missing, civilian, military, to reduce to a single figure without distortion. The men who came home and those who didn't. Of the roughly 350,000 German soldiers taken prisoner by Western Allied forces in France and Germany, a significant fraction were in Allied prisoner-of-war camps in Britain, the United States, and Canada by the end of the war. Their experience was, by most accounts, materially better than what they'd left behind. Regular food, medical care, work assignments, in some cases educational programs. But prisoner-of-war camps are not neutral environments. They are places where men sit with time and knowledge, and eventually, the accumulating awareness of what the regime they'd served had done beyond the battlefield. For many German prisoners in Allied camps, the spring of 1945 was the period when the full picture of the Nazi regime's crimes, the death camps, the systematic murder of millions, became unavoidable knowledge. The Allied forces made deliberate efforts to ensure that German prisoners understood what had been done in Germany's name. Some prisoners refused to believe it. Some had known, or suspected, and had chosen not to examine what they knew. Some confronted it with a directness that is documented in post-war accounts as genuinely anguished. The men who returned to Germany. Most prisoners were repatriated within a few years of the war's end, though some held by the Soviet Union were returned much later, came back to a country that was physically shattered and morally reorganizing itself with the specific discomfort of a society that had participated in, or failed to prevent, or simply not looked at, crimes of a scale without historical precedent. The West German state that emerged from the occupation zones in the western half of Germany chose, for the first decade or so, to handle this legacy in ways that historians have analyzed extensively and which combine genuine legal reckoning in specific cases with a broader social tendency towards silence about individual wartime experience. The men who'd been in the bunkers at Normandy, the veterans of the Bocage and the can fighting and the retreat across France. They came home to a Germany that needed to rebuild rather than to look back, and the looking back, where it happened at all, happened mostly in private. The memoir literature of German Normandy veterans is itself an interesting historical artifact. It began appearing in the 1950s and continued through the following decades, and its quality and honesty vary considerably. Some memoirs, Bayerlein's operational accounts, Sepp Dietrich's interviews, the testimonies collected by Paul Carroll for his wartime history of the campaign, are essentially apologetics, dressed as history, emphasizing tactical skill while eliding command failures and atrocities. Others are more honest in ways that are sometimes surprising, acknowledging the futility of the defensive strategy, the failures of command, the way ideology had been used to sustain fighting long past the point of any rational military justification. Heinrich Severlow's memoir, The Machine Gunner from WN-62 on Omaha Beach, is one of the most psychologically honest of these accounts because it deals directly with what it meant, across a long civilian life, to have been the specific human being at a specific weapon on a specific morning. What those men carried home, beyond the physical damage that was visible in missing limbs and hearing loss and the effects of blast concussion, was the inner weight of specific days. The 6th of June, the hedgerows in July, the Bergebas Ridge, the road east from Falaise at night with the Jabos overhead. Post-trauma Traumatic stress disorder wasn't a clinical category available to them in the language of the 1940s and 50s, and the German healthcare system of the immediate post-war period was in any case primarily concerned with physical wounds rather than psychological ones. These men mostly didn't talk about what they'd seen, not in the clinical sense and not in the social sense either. They went to work. They rebuilt. Germany rebuilt around them. The economic miracle of the West German 1950s produced a society that was, in certain respects, conspicuously oriented toward the future, because the past was very heavy and the future was lighter. I want to say something here about what I think the German veterans' silence collectively cost the historical record, and what it also preserved. The silence cost us texture, the kind of first-person emotional testimony that fills the Allied oral history collections, and that, in the British and American cases, has been meticulously gathered and preserved by institutions like the Imperial War Museum. The German equivalent is thinner, more cautious, more selective in what it reveals. What the silence preserved, paradoxically, is a kind of accuracy about what the experience actually was, because the accounts that do exist tend to be more measured and less performative than might otherwise be the case. Men who have spent a long time not talking about something, when they do talk about it, tend to strip it of the narrative heroism that gets layered onto combat experience by time and telling. The Normandy German veterans, who did speak later in life, often spoke with a flatness that is more disturbing and more honest than the polished memoir versions. The German soldiers who died in Normandy, the ones who never came home at all, are buried in a small number of German military cemeteries in Normandy, of which the largest is at La Cambe, between Bayeux and Saint-Lô, where more than 21,000 German soldiers are interred. The design philosophy of German military cemeteries of this period is consciously different from Allied ones. Lower grave markers, darker stone, oak trees that create shade rather than the open, formal geometry of Commonwealth cemeteries. The effect is somber in a specific way. The men at La Cambe came from every kind of background. Regular army conscripts, SS volunteers, Ostlegionen soldiers pressed into German service from the Soviet Union, teenagers from the Hitler Jugend, divisions who were 19 or 18 or younger. They are all under the same dark crosses. History has assigned them a collective meaning. Defenders of a regime whose crimes have no equivalents in the modern era. And that collective meaning is accurate and important. But it sits alongside the other truth, which is that they were individual human beings who were each, once, the only version of themselves that existed in the world. The Allied cemeteries in Normandy, the American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer above Omaha Beach being the most visited, face the sea. They face the direction the invasion came from, which is west. La Cambe doesn't face anywhere in particular. It's inland, in the bocage, under the oak trees. I've read accounts of veterans from both sides who visited these cemeteries in the decades after the war. And what strikes me in those accounts is the consistent observation that the cemeteries feel like the same kind of place, which they are. Whatever else Normandy was, strategically, politically, morally, it was, at the level of the individual human being, a place where very large numbers of men died in a relatively small space in a relatively short time, and the cemeteries don't really care which side you were on when they take you in. The French civilians of Normandy occupy a position in this history that I want to acknowledge, because the focus on military operations can cause them to disappear from the narrative entirely. More than 20,000 French civilians were killed in the Normandy campaign, a figure that is sometimes cited and quickly moved past, but which represents one of the heaviest concentrations of civilian loss in Western European combat of the entire war. The towns of Saint-Lô, Caen, Vire, Falaise, and dozens of smaller communities were destroyed to greater or lesser degree by a combination of Allied bombing, Allied artillery, and the movement of two large armies through them. The people who lived in these communities had been occupied for 4 years and were now liberated, genuinely liberated, in a way they had waited and hoped for, and the liberation had cost them their homes, their churches, their town centers, their neighbors. The ambivalence this produced in Norman collective memory is not ingratitude. It is the honest response to an experience that was simultaneously rescue and destruction. The German soldiers who stood in those towns, in the bunkers above those beaches, in the hedgerows of the bocage, they were the last line of a project that had imposed itself on France and most of Europe by force, and their failure to hold that line was, in the most fundamental human sense, a good outcome for the world. I don't think that's a controversial statement, and I don't mean it as one. The defeat of Germany's military capacity in the West was the precondition for everything that followed. The liberation of France, the beginning of the liberation of the Nazi concentration and death camp system, the end of a regime whose record of systematic murder is the worst in modern history. All of that is true, and alongside it, also true, the men in those bunkers were mostly not architects of that regime. They were inhabitants of it, shaped by it, in service to it, some willingly, some not, most in that uncomfortable middle territory, where individual human beings exist inside historical forces larger than themselves. What they left behind. The archaeology of watching. There is a particular kind of historical residue that attaches to places where large numbers of people experienced very intense things in a small space. And Normandy has it in abundance. The beaches are still there. Of course they are. The sand at Omaha is still the same sand, moved and shaped by 70 years of tides. The bluffs above it are still the bluffs. The concrete of the German gun batteries at Long-sur-Mer, the observation bunkers at Pointe du Hoc, the casemates at Utah Beach. They are still there because reinforced concrete, poured in, sufficient thickness, outlasts most things a modern society can apply to it short of deliberate demolition. You can stand inside them. Normandy tourism has built an industry around this standing inside, and I don't say that critically. It is, in fact, one of the more direct historical experiences available to a person who wants to understand D-Day. What I find compelling about standing in those positions is the view. The German defensive positions along the Normandy coast were sited for observation, and they are still good for observation. Stand in the main observation bunker at the Longueuil-sur-Mer battery and look north. The channel is there. On a clear day you can see a substantial distance, and what you're seeing, or trying to see, is the horizon that German observers were watching in the early morning hours of the 6th of June, 1944, as something that looked at first like a thickening of the horizon began to resolve into ships, into very many ships, into, by daylight, an armada of between 5,000 and 7,000 vessels that occupied the visible sea in a way that no amount of training or briefing or intelligence report had quite prepared the watchers for, because the specific visual reality of that many ships, more than were in some national navies, is something that has to be seen to be believed, and they were seeing it for the first time. The accounts of German observers who saw the fleet that morning, fragmentary, preserved in after-action reports and post-war memoirs, describe a common initial reaction. Not, in most cases, immediate terror or despair. Something more like incomprehension. The scale of what they were looking at didn't immediately process as a military fact. One account describes a man reporting the ships to his superior and being asked how many, and finding that the honest answer, which was something equivalent to, "I've lost count, I've run out of vocabulary for this," didn't fit the format of a military report. So he gave a number. The number he gave was smaller than the reality, because the reality was larger than any number he'd been trained to report. The Allied fleet on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, was not just the largest amphibious invasion force ever assembled. It was, at the time it appeared, larger than almost anyone on the German side had genuinely believed could exist. The Atlantic Wall is archaeology now in a way it wasn't for a long time. For decades after the war, the bunkers were simply there, maintained or not, fenced off or accessible, incorporated into farm boundaries, or left in the sand at the edge of dunes. The systematic preservation and interpretation of the German coastal defenses as heritage sites is a relatively recent development, one that has required those sites to be presented to visitors, including French visitors, in a way that acknowledges what they were built for and by whom, without being either celebratory or contemptuous. It's a curatorial challenge that different sites have handled with different degrees of success. The best presentations I've encountered are the ones that don't try to resolve the moral complexity of these installations, but instead make the visitor feel the physical reality of the space. The narrowness of the apertures, the smell of the concrete, the way sound moves inside a casemate, and let the thinking emerge from that sensory experience. There's a related category of Normandy archaeology that receives less attention: the objects, the detritus of the campaign, spent cartridge cases, abandoned equipment, the corroded remnants of vehicles and weapons, is distributed across the Norman landscape in quantities that continue to be uncovered by farmers and construction workers decades after the war. The museum collections of Normandy hold tens of thousands of artifacts recovered from the fields and beaches. A significant proportion of them are German Wehrmacht belt buckles, signal equipment, maps in their waterproof cases still folded on the sectors they were issued for, ammunition for weapons that no longer exist as weapons, cartridges whose original casing has been transformed by 7 decades of soil chemistry into something between a fossil and a sculpture. Each of these objects passed through the hands of a specific person who has been dead for 80 years. The object persists. The person is a name in a service record, if the record survived, or no name at all. The historiography of the German experience at Normandy has itself changed significantly across the decades since the war. The early post-war German histories, many of them written by former officers and published in the 1950s and 60s, tended to emphasize tactical professionalism while minimizing or entirely omitting the political and moral context of the regime in whose service that professionalism was deployed. The corrective to this came gradually, through the work of a generation of West German historians who were willing to examine the Wehrmacht's relationship to the Nazi regime with more rigor than the clean Wehrmacht myth that had developed in the post-war decade allowed. By the 1990s, the Wehrmacht exhibition touring Germany created a public confrontation with this history that was deeply uncomfortable for many veterans and their families, and that is generally credited with substantially changing the terms of German public discourse about the war. The debate continues. It continues because it's important, and because important things don't resolve cleanly. What I keep coming back to, after spending as long as I have with these archives and these accounts and these competing interpretive frameworks, is a simple observation. The men who watched the Allied fleet appear on the horizon of the 6th of June, 1944, were watching the end of something. Most of them didn't know it in those specific terms, and the ones who suspected it couldn't say so in their reports. But the thing they were watching the end of, the specific configuration of power and ideology and state violence that the Third Reich represented, was ending. And the ending was visible from their bunkers as a horizon full of ships. They would fight for 11 more months on multiple fronts, with decreasing resources and increasing desperation, and in the end, they would run out of land to defend. Germany would be occupied, divided, reconstructed, and, across the following decades, made into something very different from what it had been when those men were conscripted. The Norman coast today is quiet in the way that places are quiet after very loud things have happened in them. The tides come in and go out with the seasonal regularity they've had since before there were human beings to observe them. The towns rebuilt, Caen, Saint-Lô, Falaise, rebuilt in the architectural styles of the 1950s and 60s, new buildings on medieval street plans, the occasional preserved medieval tower standing above post-war residential blocks as a kind of stratigraphic marker for where the old city ended and the reconstructed one began. The cemeteries are maintained. The bunkers stand, and in them, on any given day in the tourist season, people French, American, British, German, Japanese, people from everywhere. Stand at the apertures and look out at the channel and imagine what it looked like on that specific morning when the horizon moved. The long reckoning. What Normandy tells us now. I want to be honest with you about why I made this documentary, or rather, why I spent as long as I did in these archives assembling this specific story. It wasn't the battle that drew me in first. I've read Normandy histories since I was old enough to find them in the library. What drew me in was a question that kept surfacing in the documents and that none of the mainstream accounts quite answered to my satisfaction. What does a military defeat of this scale do to the people who experience it from the losing side? Not in the political sense, not in the aggregate casualty sense, but at the level of the individual human being. The machine gunner in his concrete box, the tank commander trying to move his Panther through a road under air attack, the divisional commander receiving orders from a headquarters that had stopped being able to process reality. What does it do to you? And what do you do with it afterward? The German veterans of Normandy, the ones who came home, who lived long enough to be interviewed, who were willing to talk, describe something that I think is genuinely hard to name precisely. It isn't simply shame, though for some it contains shame. It isn't survivor's guilt exactly, though that's present in some accounts. It's something more like a specific kind of retrospective cognitive dissonance. The experience of having fought hard and well and with considerable professional skill in service of a project that you have since been forced to understand was, at its core, criminal. The skill was real. The commitment was real. The courage under sustained pressure was real. And the regime that directed all of that toward its purposes was one of the worst in human history. How do you hold those things simultaneously? The answer, for most of those men, was, you don't. You hold one at a time. You emphasize the unit, the comrades, the specific engagement, the immediate task, and you keep the larger frame at a distance, because the larger frame is unbearable. The Battle of Normandy produced one of the war's most clear-cut strategic outcomes, which was the irreversible opening of the Western Front and the beginning of the direct Allied advance toward Germany. It did this at a cost, Allied, German, French civilian, that any honest account must acknowledge was enormous. The Allied casualties in the Normandy campaign from D-Day through the closing of the Falaise pocket number in the tens of thousands killed and several times that wounded. German casualties, killed, wounded, captured, and missing, number in the hundreds of thousands. French civilian casualties, as I've noted, exceed 20,000. These numbers are not clean. They come from record sets with gaps and inconsistencies and different national counting methodologies. But their scale is not in doubt, and their human weight, each figure representing a single person with a family and a history and a specific future that didn't happen, is something I think it's important to sit with, rather than present, and move past quickly. What Normandy established, at the cost of all that, was the strategic foundation for everything that came in the 11 months between June of 1944 and May of 1945. The liberation of France, the liberation of Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, large parts of Italy, the relief of pressure on the Soviet Union, which had been doing the overwhelming bulk of the fighting against Germany since June of 1941, and which had suffered losses that dwarf the Western Allied casualty figures by an order of magnitude. The closing in from east and west and south on the geography of the Third Reich until there was no more geography left to defend. The end of the war in Europe came from the convergence of multiple Allied efforts, of which Normandy was one, the most visible one, in Western consciousness, but one among several that together made the outcome inevitable. The German defenders of Normandy are, in the historical memory of the Western world, primarily background. They are the resistance that the Allied landings overcame, the obstacles between the opening scene and the liberation of Paris. This is understandable. This is whose story the Western world chose, and that choice reflects whose stories are most natural to tell and hear in a democratic Western cultural context. What I've been trying to do in this documentary is not to rehabilitate the German defenders or to suggest a false equivalence between the sides. Those men were serving a regime whose crimes have no equivalence in the modern era, but to insist that history at the human scale requires us to hold the full picture in frame, including the specific human experience of the people on the other side of the largest battle in Western European history. You understand D-Day more fully when you understand what the men in the bunkers saw. You understand the campaign in Normandy more fully when you understand the operational situation those defenders were navigating, the command failures, the supply breakdowns, the institutional cowardice of a high command that knew the situation was hopeless and couldn't say so. You understand the war's end more fully when you understand the retreat and the reconstitution and the final defensive campaign, and the specific weight that history subsequently placed on the survivors. The most honest sentence I've read in the German veteran literature is not a dramatic one. It appears in a memoir published decades after the war and describes, with a precision that I find devastating in its simplicity, the moment of surrender for one individual soldier. He had done what he'd been told to do for as long as he could do it, and now he was being marched east under Allied guard, and the war for him was over, and he was alive, and he didn't know how to feel about either of those things. I don't know how to feel about them either. I think that ambivalence, that not knowing, is the appropriate response to a history this heavy. It's what keeps you honest. It's what keeps you coming back to the archives, the maps, the letters written in the dark by men who didn't know what the morning would bring. The 6th of June, 1944. 06:30 hours. The ramps go down, the sea is cold, the morning is gray, and somewhere in a concrete bunker above one of the most contested beaches in human memory, a young man is at a weapon he's been trained to use, watching what the horizon has delivered, understanding, in the wordless clarity of immediate physical experience, that the world he knew, the world that put him in that bunker, that handed him that weapon, that told him this beach could be held, is ending. He fires. He holds his post. He does what soldiers do, long past the point where what soldiers do can change anything. And eventually, in France or Germany or a prisoner of war camp in England or America, it stops, for him, and for the vast institution whose last western wall he'd been holding. What they left behind, in the concrete and the sand and the dark records in the archives, is not a monument to anything. It's a question that the history keeps asking, about what human beings are capable of sustaining under the worst possible pressures and in the worst possible moral circumstances, and how the two of those things, the capability and the circumstance, exist together in the same event, in the same life, without resolving into something clean. I've been sitting with this question for a long time. I don't have a clean answer. I'm not sure the clean answer is the honest one. This is where we stop. Not because the story is over, but because this is where the story becomes yours to carry forward. Good night.